On the subject, if I may, because it was nicely teed up to come to Salim Chatgai now, who, some say that you represent this strand of a very orthodox
it's
Islam.
not orthodox, it's really heretic.
Well, I don't know what I believe yet, so
your spiritual mentor, Hatham al-Haddad, has said, for example, he said this, right? A man should not be questioned why he hit his wife, because this is something between them. Leave them alone. They can sort it out. Matters between themselves. Now, one of the biggest problems is that wives do not obey their husbands because of this feminism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what he's been quoted a lot of out of context a lot of times.
So those are his...
Well, would you agree? I'm not here to answer him, but what I will say...
agree with that statement?
No, let me just explain what they...
Majid asks, do you agree with that statement?
I say, no, of course not, I don't agree with that statement, but I don't believe, because I know him very well, I don't believe he would have said something like that. He's been quoted out of context many a time by a very
we took it verbatim off YouTube.
The thing is, we need to, first of all, we need to understand what was the as I said, and I said this to you before.
What was the context?
I mean, as I said before, that some people don't have necessarily the right ways of necessarily expressing themselves. But I think the point here is simply this: is that first of all, that question that you brought up in your that you experienced on Islam.
Sorry, hold on, hang on. Is there any context that can justify wife beating? Is there any context that can justify that sentence?
No, but we know, for example, that anything that's happening between a man and wife, of course, we have to live subject to the law. But the fact is, one thing is that what Sheikh Haytham is trying to do, and he's saying that a lot of problems, rather than taking them to the police, should ideally be handled within the community.
No, he's not. He's saying you can beat your wife, and that I have no right to say that you can't beat your wife. That's what he's saying.
The Wahhabi translation of this
the fact is,
the Wahhabi Salafi translation says, beat your wife, but lightly. Now, I mean, how the heck do you beat someone lightly? It is this kind of Neanderthal interpretation of Islam and the Quran that brings our great religion into disrepute.
Okay, first of all,
the Wahhabis and the Salafis malign Islam. And when your mentor spouses Wahhabi nonsense, they only make life more difficult for us here in the UK.
Taj, one of the biggest problems is that wives do not obey their husbands because of this feminism.
Well, basically, what is it? In Islam, we have an issue of rights and responsibilities. For example, I have to obey my mother. My mother is obviously a woman. So, just taking this out of context...
Does your wife have to obey you?
Yes, she does.
See, do you have to obey her?
Yes, in some aspects, absolutely, yes.
I think there is an issue.
This is the problem.
With any religion, and we do have this in Islam as well, where you have ultra-orthodox, traditionalist, conservative interpretations.
Again, we're having labels.
You have progressive. At the end of the day, no matter how much we believe, I as a Muslim believe in the Quran, I believe in the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but I would seriously challenge many of the interpretations because human beings are mediating and interpreting. And just as I can read in the Bible, happy is the one who dashes those babies against the walls in retribution when Jerusalem was captured.
We did all this last week, the Bible.
In the same way, Jesus, peace be upon him, talked about turning the other cheek. You can pick, you can do these things.
When you get,
Salma,
the point remains, and I think it's a very important one, that, I mean, the Islam Channel has got into some heat recently because of Imams on it, who's saying the sorts of things that Anne Leslie was talking about. And these things, you can go on YouTube and see any of these preachers and Imams who have a lot of influence on young people saying things that are to our ears and to civilized people's ears horrific.
See, Nikki, it was Quilliam that did that survey on the Islam Channel. We then reported them to Ofcom, and Ofcom ruled against them.
What sort of stuff were they saying?
We monitored them for about 4 months, and we recorded all the shows, put them up onto YouTube, and then with the electronic report, put the links to the YouTube videos to prove that it wasn't taken out of context, which is the usual response that you get. What Islam Channel did was, they complained to YouTube and said, take these videos down because they've been loaded up without our permission, and it's a violation of copyright. But the fact is they did say those things. On the most popular channel for British Muslims, which is broadcast across the world, there were so-called imams on there saying that you can beat your wives. And they were saying that you can use this thing called a miswak, which is a small stick, to beat your wives with lightly. And I think that type of rubbish that's coming out of these sorts of channels, it must be challenged. Now, to put it all into context...
And it gives Muslims a bad name.
It does give Muslims a bad name. Now, not every Muslim says these things, but the tiny minority that are saying...
dominant strain here.
And that, so we must challenge that.
Philip Lewis, you've had a close look at Salim Chatkey's website and the website of such... I mean, how influential are they? How dangerous are they, this particular Wahhabist strand?
It's quite a difficult question. I mean, I think already what has been very obvious is when we talk in easy terms and lazy terms about Muslims, we have to distinguish between different sorts of Muslims. In the Christian tradition, we wouldn't confuse and conflate Ian Paisley with the Pope, but we routinely do that sort of thing with different Muslim groups. So I think we have to be kind of grown up about complexity in the Muslim communities. It's fairly evident among our panelists that there are quite divergent readings of the tradition. And the Saudis do have disproportionate influence because of petrodollars. Of course they do. And of course that has added a layer of intra-Muslim sectarianism. Of course it has. And I think any grown-up conversation is going to bring that out in an appropriate way.
I was born and brought up to begin with in Pakistan, which at that stage was actually more Sufi, which is more mystical. For example, it loves music. One of the greatest musicians, Qawwali music, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, whom I worshipped. I know that's not a Muslim thing you're allowed to do. Now, of course, now you get, in Pakistan, you get songs are forbidden because it's getting more and more fundamentalist. And I fear that the more that the money is given to these extremist groups throughout the world, incidentally, the more we are going to have the clash of civilizations. But it was not necessarily. In Pakistan, when I was there, it was fine. But now, Pakistan there are more people killed, Muslims killing Muslims in Pakistan every year than they ever managed to kill a single American.
Because we can't ignore the geopolitics in this. I agree that the Saudi petrodollars have had a distorting impact on the competing theologies. The fact is there are competing theologies. We have to be open and honest about that. Also make it the correct proportion. They're a minority, but still they have this
they're not
powerful...
A minority.
They are a minority.
They're not a minority.
The vast majority of Muslims in this country are not ultra-conservative, traditionalists.
If you look at the number of mosques, there's mostly Deobandi, which is Wahhabi type. But other important point to make. The other important point to make, just on Philip's point, the other important point to make is this, is that it's not just petrodollars. The other thing that what the Wahhabis and the Saudis have, what they have is the control of Mecca and Medina. Now when you control the Haramain, the two most important sites in Islam, plus marry that with the petrodollars, that's a toxic mix.
Saudi Arabia is run by a dictatorship which is propped up completely by the West. Right. This is not conspiracy.
We're going to get on. No, I know it's not conspiracy. I'm only saying that I want to go into we're starting with the identity issues. I want to get on to the foreign policy a little bit later.
No, I'm not talking about the foreign policy. I'm talking about the theology and why it has the influence. Because that particular brand, whilst they're ultra-orthodox and conservative on social elements, on political elements, they say, do not question your leaders, and they make that a religious obligation, that don't enter politics and don't question your leaders.
But that's before America got involved.
And that's why they actually were encouraged by the West, and Muslims have had to bear the brunt of it, and the vast majority challenge it.
Let's talk about integration. Should you, I mean, one question that you sometimes see, should you take a lesson from Jewish communities, the way that they have integrated over the years?
I mean, yeah, if you mean by integration that Muslims become part and parcel of the society, they see themselves as British citizens, that they can contribute positively while at the same time practicing their religion, then of course this is what we all want. This is what all the scholars in this country...
This discussion comes up with evangelical Christians as well from some people. What if that religion is at odds with the law?
Well, okay, the thing is that
like on women's rights or on homosexuality, for example.
Okay, well, for example, we know that as far as Islam is concerned, homosexuality is a sin, but it does not mean that we as Muslims are allowed allowed to attack them or allowed to insult them or anything like that. Rather, we are supposed to engage with anybody in Indian society.
They believe in attacking the homosexuals.
Okay, no, they don't believe that. No, they don't believe that.
Let's hear him out.
Yeah, that's a caricature. I mean, look, let's face it, everybody believes in rule of law. People believe in rule of law. So in Islam, there is a law against a public act of penetrative homosexuality. That's what it ultimately punishes. Now, nobody does that. So Islam is not interested in what people do in their bedroom. What it's more interested in is what people do in public. So if anyone look at the law that people talk about the very severe, harsh punishments. The burden of proof is so severe that it would possibly never happen in a modern society.
But it does happen.
But usually,
I'm Leslie. Is it something that's done in Britain?
No, of course not. That's not exactly. You can't take the law into your own hands. That's why we're not talking about that right now. I mean,
again, I've worked a lot in Saudi and Iran, and of course, in both cases, I had to. Well, I chose to. When in Rome, I chose to wear the bin bags, and I chose to behave beautifully in an Islamic way.
Very tolerant, aren't you, Jane?
Sorry?
Very tolerant to call it a bin bag. Thank you.
Well, they are actually.
Really?
You haven't had to struggle around in 30 degrees heat, wearing thick black abayas and everything. And
all men should wear one before they ask women to wear one.
Yes, and also I was told
most women choose to wear one.
No, they wash.
Wait, that's the country which we're talking about. In this country, most women choose to wear it.
Wait a minute.
Most women in this country who wear it of their own accord.
Whether
that
they say
caricature
that
doesn't work.
Do you approve of the fact that in Islamic schools in this country, little girls, 11 years old, who don't really have much choice, their uniform stipulates the full hair covering hijab. Do you think they have a choice? No, they don't.
Well, he's asked a question, let's hear the answer.
That's completely different.
Wait a minute. Wait, he's asked a question, let's hear the answer.
In some Jewish schools, they have to wear the kippah, they have to wear the skull cap.
They don't have to, actually,
they do. In Orthodox school, they have to wear it. So why the uniform is, the Muslims who choose to send their school there, to send their children there, they know that and they want their children to do that.
Do you approve of those parents?
Can I just say,
I want to hear from Miriam Francois Sarrail. We haven't heard from you yet, and I know
that's actually true.
You have been dying to come in.
Well, I wanted to come back on one of the points that Dame Leslie made about Buddhists. We don't hear about Buddhists. That's because the proportion of Buddhists in this country is incredibly small. However, if you were in Japan, certainly around the time of the bombing of the Tokyo metro, you would have heard about the Buddhist-inspired bombing of the Tokyo metro. And certainly there are other cases around the world in which there are other religious groups that are a minority that do use religiously inspired rhetoric to justify violence. This isn't exclusively a Muslim issue. But I think when we get to the topic of integration, it's very important for us to focus on the fact that if you define integration in a very narrow manner on issues like morality, which is essentially differences of opinion, that's a very narrow way of understanding it. But if you actually look at the substantive issues like identification with the country, identification with the institutions within that country, then you find that Muslims rank incredibly high. In fact, according to the Gallup survey of 2009, Muslims rank higher than the broader population, both on loyalty to Britain and respect for the institutions of this country, the police, the judiciary. And I think it was also important that you pointed out that Muslims perhaps sought to look at the Jews in terms of a model for integration. The 2001 census pointed out that the two communities that are most geographically isolated, geographically ghettoized, if you like, are Jewish and Sikh communities. And another survey pointed out...
Some Jewish people, though.
Well, no, you can say so. I'm just going on the census. The census is what it is. It's also important to point out that the communities which isolate themselves most from meeting others are the dominant ethnic community in this society. That's the dominant white community, are those that isolate themselves the most. So it's important to get back to the facts here. Muslims are not...
You want to come in at this point, Davis Lewis?
It's ridiculous to say.
Well, let's Davis come.
Look, I don't want to enter into this very interesting debate over theology, which I think is important, but which is something that's important to be had inside Islam among Muslims. What is clear, however, is that we must make a distinction between some of these things. For example, when we are talking about integration, we're talking about talking about ghettos. What we are talking about is for residential clusters That might be to do with economics, that might be to do with all sorts of other things, to do with new communities coming up. Those issues that arise legitimately and that we can debate and attempt to better are very, very different from the kinds of issues that are driven, for example, in the Wahhabi agenda by Saudi money, driven in terms of to bring home a message by a very small subset that are specifically seeking to impose their views.
Is that our fault then? Because you're an advisor to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Homeland Security. You speak in your own capacity here.